The point you brought up with the Ukraine war, I think, is a very appropriate one because for 2 years now, the pro-Ukraine side, which totally dominates the American establishment, the political landscape, has denounced Russia in the harshest possible terms for its alleged brutality against Ukrainian civilians, amounting to, for example, firing missiles that occasionally kill a few Ukrainian civilians. There's absolutely no evidence that the Russians have made the slightest effort to deliberately target Ukrainian civilians. Occasionally, their missiles fired at a military target kill a handful of civilians, inadvertently. But I mean, we're talking about, I think the total number of the women and children, civilians killed in the Ukraine conflict is and that's been going on for almost 2 years now, it's just a tiny fraction of the number killed in just 2 months of the Gaza conflict, where the Israelis are deliberately targeting all of these civilian infrastructure buildings in Gaza. So, I mean, it's a totally different position. And when you have this sort of incredible hypocrisy, where, for example, where the International Court of Justice in The Hague filed an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, because he'd evacuated ethnic Russian children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia, so that they'd be safe until the fighting ended. When those charges are filed against him, while on the other hand, absolutely nothing is done against the Israeli government, which has clearly followed a policy of deliberately killing many, many thousands of Palestinian children. I mean, it just shows the incredible hypocrisy of the West. And that sort of thing over the long run destroys the West's influence and certainly destroys the influence of the United States and also the influence such that existed of Israel. So, I mean, I think, for example, in Europe, increasingly, I think the European media has become more and more under the control of the broader Western media. In other words, I think 20 or 30 years ago, the European media was much more independent on these Middle Eastern issues, while now both the European governments and the European media are much more subservient to the sort of pro-Israel line than they used to be. But I mean, with these gigantic atrocities going on and so many Europeans seeing them in social media or in videos, I think at some point there may be a collapse of support. And I mean, the same thing, for example, with the Ukraine war. I think more and more Europeans are realizing that they've been lied to for the last 2 years about the Ukraine's prospects and what really was happening in that conflict. So at some point, I mean, with the Nord Stream pipeline, with possible energy crisis this winter, I mean, those factors I think may cause a complete collapse in European support for this sort of broader Western pro-Israel agenda. And I think if that happens, I mean, that will be obviously a strategic disaster for the United States and might very well involve even the collapse of NATO after, whatever, 70 years or 80 years.